December 24th this past year, and I'm sitting in lab waiting for the brain samples to come up from the autopsy suite. And this night was different than most because it was the night that my Aunt Josie died. My aunt lived about a mile from here. She lived in New York her whole life, ever since 1939. When I moved to New York, I would go to church with her on occasion. She worked at the church. And we'd go to the service, and afterwards we'd go to brunch. And we would go to Serafina. She would always get the margarita pizza. And I would hear about the most recent fiasco at the church. We talked about healthcare. We talked about the homeless problem in New York. And the church had an amazing shelter that she helped, giving time and money to develop. We would talk about politics, something she was very passionate about. I told her, guess what? Hillary Clinton is going to help us get more money for healthcare for people who can't afford it. And she said, Whitney, politicians are all liars. How did she know this? She was very well read. Every morning she would wake up and read the newspaper. And when I'd go over to her apartment, she'd have the New York Times from every day of the week on her table. And she would read it front to back. Later on during the week, she would send me emails of articles that were perfectly relevant to what we had discussed earlier that week. She told me she was an amazing listener. My Aunt Josie was always giving, so it was a huge surprise when I found out that she had cancer, because I couldn't imagine something taking from her. She was diagnosed with colon cancer, and it had spread to her lungs. So I knew that it was not going to be very much longer for her. She decided to do palliative chemotherapy, and I would go with her to the chemotherapy session. It was a couple hours, and I would sit with her and we'd talk about politics, and she would get pretty passionate about that. I would tell her about all my difficult decisions in life, and she would say, Whitney, do something or don't, but decide. She had a pragmatism that was unparalleled, and it was one time I was in Central Park and I was running and I got a phone call. It was from Mary from the church. She had checked in on Josie to take her to church that morning, and she found Josie on the floor. And Josie had been on the floor all night long. So she said, Whitney, what do I do? I'm not sure what to do. She's okay, but she can't move very well. What do I do? And I was thinking, why is she asking me what to do? I'm not there. I realized she was asking me because I'm a doctor and I'm supposed to know what to do in these situations. But I'm her niece in this situation and I have no idea. But I remembered that in medical school we learned that when someone is lying in one position without moving for a prolonged period of time, their muscles start to break down. And when your muscles start to break down, it's toxic and it can damage your kidneys. And I thought, well, this is something, my aunt needs fluids, she's probably dehydrated. So I told her to take her to the hospital. So I hung up the phone and I kept on running. I was scared. I didn't want to see my aunt weak. I didn't want to see her in the hospital. So I finished my loop of Central Park and eventually made my way to the hospital. There I saw her in the emergency room. She was on the gurney and she had an IV line in her arm. And she said to me, Whitney, why are you wearing your running clothes? You're a doctor. Look like a doctor. I was like, but I knew that this was a point in time when her health was getting worse. And after that point, she decided to move into the hospice floor a block away from where I lived. And I knew at that time that it was only a short period of time we would have left together, and I wanted to make it worth it. So, as a graduate student in the neuroscience program, being at Mount Sinai was a blessing. It was the most perfect decision for me, because not only did I get to work in a neuroscience lab and study the brain and study molecular biology and look at cells in the brain, but I got to study schizophrenia. And that was important to me because Josie's mother and my grandmother also suffered from schizophrenia. And so it was this trifecta of this lab where I got to study all three things, and it's my PhD project. And so when I joined the lab and my supervisor told me about this project, we decided it was going to be the perfect one for me. It was a project where we look at individual cells in the brain and map these cells together. And the goal is to find new cells that are involved in schizophrenia. Not only this, we get to map cells in the brain. I thought this was amazing. There are a couple challenges to a study like this. One is that in order to map cells, they have to be alive. So I thought, where am I going to get live human brain cells? There are a few places. One is if you're in surgery. Sometimes in surgeries, where they take out part of the brain, you can take out brain that's still alive. But that's only a small region that the surgeon is working on. The other place is with patients who just die. There's a small period of time where their cells are still alive. And I thought, who do I know would donate their brain? And I thought about my Aunt Josie and how giving she was. And I thought, would she give me her brain? I was really scared and excited at the same time. I wasn't sure what she would say. I actually went to the hospice floor and walked into the room and almost turned around because I didn't know how to ask her for her brain. But then I kept on walking and I sat down on the bed next to her and I said, Josie, I'm doing this PhD project and it's looking at cells in the brain. Would you be willing to donate? And she looked at me and she said, Whitney, I thought I already agreed to that. Plus, why are you asking me? I'm going to be dead. And I breathed a sigh of relief because Josie's pragmatism and her logical explanations came back in this moment, and I realized that she did want to give. So it was at 11 p.m. on the 23rd that I got a call. I was woken up by my phone. I got a call from my aunt. She said, Whitney, didn't you hear Josie died? And no, I hadn't heard. But I didn't have too much time to think about her dying because I was thinking about her cells living. So I rushed out of my apartment and around the block to the hospice floor. And I went up to her room, and meanwhile I was calling the funeral home attendant to come get her, and I said, Josie died, it's time to get her to the hospital. He knew we had to go quickly as possible. I got into the room and I walked in and I saw her on the bed, and it was as if she wasn't there anymore. The funeral home attendant came in and he ushered me out and said, it's time for me to do my job. So I walk out in the hallway, and a couple minutes later, he comes out with a black, dark bag on a gurney. And he pushes the gurney into the elevator. And I look at the elevator and said, I'm going to take the stairs. So I rush down the stairs, meet them at the bottom, and he puts her into the hearse. And then I'm like, do I go in there? He's like, no, you're not allowed. Take a cab. So I hail a cab, and I hop in the cab, and I tell the cabbie, follow that hearse. And the cabbie looks back at me, and he says, I'm not allowed to follow cars. It's against the rules. I'm like, it's 2 a.m, it's a hearse, there's nothing, like, just go to Mount Sinai as quickly as possible. So we get to Mount Sinai at the same time as the hearse, and we get to the loading dock. And outside the loading dock is a phone, security phone. So I pick it up, and I tell the security guard, we have an autopsy. We need to be let in right now. And he said, we don't have anything scheduled for 1 o'clock. I said, it's a warm autopsy. We have no way of knowing when this is going to happen. Let us in. He refused to let us in. So I had to wait until the morgue attendant came. After what seemed like forever, the morgue attendant opened the cargo bay door, and the hearse went in. Meanwhile, I went up to the lab, and I waited. Now, I was calling another person, another member of our team. We had 2 parts to this experiment. The second part needed our expert, and he was not answering his phone. I was calling, and I called 21 times on his phone. I knew that he was sleeping. His phone was probably on silent. I was desperate, so I kept on calling. And I thought, okay, well, we're going to go through as much of this as we can, and we'll see what happens. We can't do the experiment if he's not there, but maybe he will be there. So when I was in lab, we waited, and the tissue finally came up from the autopsy suite. And I looked at the samples, and I thought, wow, this is Josie's brain. And it seemed like part of her. We started processing the samples and pulling out the cells, and I realized that these were just cells. And the thing about this experiment that was interesting is that it also had never been done before. So we were rushing through trying to get these samples prepared in time. And after 5 hours, I wasn't sure whether her cells would still be alive. After the samples were prepared, I got a call, and our expert to do the second part had woken up, and he said he was on his way. And I was so relieved. And I said, thank God we could do this. So I checked the samples, and there's a dye that we use to put on the cells, and if the cells are blue, it means they're dead. But if they're yellow, it means they're alive. So I took the samples, and I put them under the microscope, and I looked down, holding my breath, and I saw beautiful, pearly yellow cells. I knew at that moment that Josie would be proud, and that she was going to give back in studying the science of the brain.